32. On the death of Tullius, the government devolved once more upon the Senate, and they nominated an inter rex, and on his holding the comitia, the people elected Ancus Marcius king. The fathers confirmed the election. Ancus Marcius was the grandson of King Numa Pompilius by his daughter. As soon as he ascended the throne, reflecting on the renown of his grandfather, and that the late reign, glorious in every other respect, in one particular had not been sufficiently prosperous, the rites of religion having either been utterly neglected or improperly performed, deeming it of the highest importance to perform the public ceremonies of religion as they had been instituted by Numa, he orders the pontiff, after he had transcribed them all from the king's commentaries on white tables, to expose them to public view. Hence, both his own subjects, desirous of peace, and the neighboring nations, entertained a hope that the king would conform to the conduct and institutions of his grandfather. Accordingly, the Latins, with whom a treaty had been concluded in the reign of Tullius, assumed new courage, and after they had made an incursion upon the Roman lands, return a contemptuous answer to the Romans on their demanding restitution, supposing that the Roman king would spend his reign in indolence among chapels and altars. The genius of Ancus was of a middle kind, partaking both of that of Numa and of Romulus, and, besides that, he thought that peace was more necessary in his grandfather's reign, considering the people were but recent as well as uncivilized. He also considered that he could not, without injury, preserve the tranquillity which had fallen to his lot, that his patience was tried, and being tried, was now despised, and that the times were more suited to a King Tullius than to a Numa. In order, however, that as Numa had instituted religious rites in peace, ceremonies relating to war might be transmitted by him, and that wars might not only be waged, but proclaimed also according to some rite, he borrowed from an ancient nation, the Equicoli, the form which the heralds still preserve, according to which restitution is demanded. The ambassador, when he comes to the frontiers of the people from whom satisfaction is demanded, having his head covered with a fillet, the fillet is of wool, says, "Hear, O Jupiter, hear, ye confines, naming the nation they belong to, let justice hear. I am a public messenger of the Roman people. I come justly and religiously deputed, and let my words gain credit." He then makes his demands. Afterwards he makes a solemn appeal to Jupiter. "If I unjustly or impiously demand those persons and those goods to be given up to me, the messenger of the Roman people, then never permit me to enjoy my native country." These words he repeats when he passes over the frontiers, the same to the first man he meets, the same on entering the gate, the same on entering the forum, some few words in the form of the declaration and oath being changed. If the persons whom he demands are not delivered up, on the expiration of 33 days, for so many are enjoined by the rule, he declares war, thus, "Hear, Jupiter, and thou, Juno, Romulus, and all ye celestial, terrestrial, and infernal gods, give ear. I call you to witness, that this nation, naming it, is unjust, and does not act with equity. But we will consult the fathers in our own country concerning these matters, and by what means we may obtain our right." After that the messenger returns to Rome to consult. The king immediately used to consult the fathers almost in the following words: "Concerning such matters, differences, and quarrels, as the Pater Patratus of the Roman people, the Quirites, has conferred with the Pater Patratus of the ancient Latins, and with the ancient Latin people, which matters ought to be given up, performed, discharged, which matters they have neither given up, performed, nor discharged, declare," says he to him, whose opinion he first asked, "What think you?" Then he said, "I think that they should be demanded by a just and regularly declared war, therefore I consent and vote for it." Then the others were asked in order, and when the majority of those present agreed in the same opinion, the war was resolved on. It was customary for the Fetialius to carry in his hand a javelin pointed with steel, or burnt at the end and dipped in blood, to the confines of the enemy's country, and in presence of at least 3 grown-up persons, to say, "Forasmuch as the states of the ancient Latins and the ancient Latin people have offended against the Roman people, the Quirites, forasmuch as the Roman people, the Quirites, have ordered that there should be war with the ancient Latins, and the Senate of the Roman people, the Quirites, have given their opinion, consented, and voted that war should be made with the ancient Latins. On this account I and the Roman people declare and make war on the states of the ancient Latins, and on the ancient Latin people." After he had said that, he threw the spear within their confines. After this manner restitution was demanded from the Latins at that time, and war proclaimed, and that usage posterity have adopted. 33. Ancus, having committed the care of sacred things to the Flamines and other priests, set out with a new army, which he had levied, and took Politorium, a city of the Latins, by storm, and following the example of former kings, who had increased the Roman state by taking enemies into the number of the citizens, he transplanted all the people to Rome. And since the Sabines occupied the Capitol and citadel, and the Albans the Celian Mount around the Palatium, the residence of the old Romans, the Aventine was assigned to the new people. Not long after, on Telani and Ficana being taken, new citizens were added in the same quarter. After this Politorium was taken a second time by force of arms, because the ancient Latins had taken possession of it when vacated. This was the cause of the Romans demolishing that city, that it might not ever after serve as a receptacle to the enemy. At last, the whole war with the Latins being concentrated in Medulla, they fought there with various fortune, sometimes the one and sometimes the other gaining the victory. For the town was both well fortified by works, and strengthened by a strong garrison, and the Latins, having pitched their camp in the open fields, had several times fought the Romans in close engagement. At last Ancus, making an effort with all his forces, obtained a complete victory over them in a pitched battle, and having got a considerable booty, returned thence to Rome. Many thousands of the Latins being then also admitted into the city, to whom, in order that the Aventine might be joined to the Palatium, a settlement was assigned near the temple of Murcia. The Janiculum was likewise added, not for want of room, but lest at any time it should become a lodgment for the enemy. It was determined to join it to the city, not only by a wall, but likewise, for the sake of the convenience of passage, by a wooden bridge, then for the first time built across the Tiber. The Fossa Quiritium, no inconsiderable defence against the easy access to the city from the low grounds, is the work of King Ancus. The state being augmented by such great accessions, seeing that, amid such a multitude of persons, the distinction of right and wrong being as yet confounded, clandestine crimes were committed, a prison is built in the heart of the city, overlooking the Forum, to intimidate the growing licentiousness. And not only was the city increased under this king, but the territory also and the boundaries. The Mesian forest was taken from the Veientes, the Roman dominion was extended as far as the sea, and the city of Ostia built at the mouth of the Tiber. Salt pits were formed around it, and, in consequence of the distinguished success achieved in war, the temple of Jupiter Feretrius was enlarged. 34. In the reign of Ancus, Lucumo, a rich and enterprising man, came to settle at Rome, prompted chiefly by the desire and hope of obtaining great preferment there, which he had no means of attaining at Tarquinii, for there also he was descended from an alien stock. He was the son of Demaratus, a Corinthian, who, flying his country for sedition, had happened to settle at Tarquinii, and having married a wife there, had 2 sons by her. Their names were Lucumo and Aruns. Lucumo survived his father, and became heir to all his property. Aruns died before his father, leaving a wife pregnant. The father did not long survive the son, and as he, not knowing that his daughter-in-law was pregnant, died without taking any notice of his grandchild in his will, to the boy that was born after the death of his grandfather, without having any share in his fortune, the name of Egerius was given on account of his poverty. And when his wealth already inspired Lucumo, on the other hand, the heir of all his father's wealth, with elevated notions, Tanaquil, whom he married, further increased such feeling, she being descended from a very high family, and one who would not readily brook the condition into which she had married to be inferior to that in which she had been born. As the Etrurians despised Lucumo, because sprung from a foreign exile, she could not bear the affront, and regardless of the innate love of her native country, provided she might see her husband advance to honours, she formed the determination to leave Tarquinii. Rome seemed particularly suited for her purpose. In this state, lately founded, where all nobility is recent and the result of merit, there would be room for her husband, a man of courage and activity. Tatius a Sabine had been king of Rome. Numa had been sent for from Cures to reign there, Ancus was sprung from a Sabine mother, and rested his nobility on the single statue of Numa. She easily persuades him, as being ambitious of honours, and one to whom Tarquinii was his country only on the mother's side. Accordingly, removing their effects, they set out together for Rome. They happened to have reached the Janiculum. There, as he sat in the chariot with his wife, an eagle, suspended on her wings, gently stooping, takes off his cap, and flying round the chariot with loud screams, as if she had been sent from heaven for the very purpose, orderly replaced it on his head, and then flew aloft. Tanaquil is said to have received this omen with great joy, being a woman well skilled, as the Etrurians generally are, in celestial prodigies, and embracing her husband, bids him hope for high and elevated fortune, that such bird had come from such a quarter of the heavens, and the messenger of such a god, that it had exhibited the omen around the highest part of man, that it had lifted the ornament placed on the head of man, to restore it to the same, by direction of the gods. Carrying with them these hopes and thoughts, they entered the city, and having purchased a house there, they gave out the name of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. His being a stranger and very rich, caused him to be taken notice of by the Romans. He also promoted his own good fortune by his affable address, by the courteousness of his invitations, and by conciliating those whom he could by acts of kindness, until a report of him reached even to the palace, and by paying court to the king with politeness and address, he in a short time so improved the acquaintance to the footing of intimate friendship, that he was present at all public and private deliberations, foreign and domestic, and being now tried in every trust, he was at length, by the king's will, appointed guardian to his children. 35. Ancus reigned 24 years, equal to any of the former kings both in the arts and renown of war and peace. His sons were now nigh the age of puberty. For this reason Tarquin was more urgent that the assembly for the election of a king should be held as soon as possible. The assembly being proclaimed, he sent away the boys to hunt towards the time of their meeting. He is said to have been the first who earnestly sued for the crown, and to have made a set speech for the purpose of gaining the affections of the people. He said that he did not aim at anything unprecedented, for that he was not the first foreigner, a thing at which any one might feel indignation or surprise, but the third who aspired to the sovereignty of Rome. That Tatius, not only from being an alien, but even an enemy, was made king. That Numa, unacquainted with the city, and without soliciting it, had been voluntarily invited by them to the throne. That he, as soon as he was his own master, had come to Rome with his wife and whole fortune, and had there spent a greater part of that age, in which men are employed in civil offices, than he had in his native country, that he had both in peace and war thoroughly learned the Roman laws and religious customs, under a master not to be objected to, King Ancus himself, that he had vied with all in duty and loyalty to his prince, and even with the king himself in his bounty to others. While he was recounting these undoubted facts, the people by a great majority elected him king. The same ambition which had prompted Tarquin, in other respects an excellent man, to aspire to the crown, followed him whilst on the throne. And being no less mindful of strengthening his own power than of increasing that of the commonwealth, he elected 100 into the fathers, who from that time were called minorum gentium, i.e. of the younger families, a party hearty in the king's cause, by whose favour they had got into the Senate. The first war he waged was with the Latins, from whom he took the town of Appioli by storm, and having brought back thence more booty than the character of the war would lead one to expect, he celebrated games with more cost and magnificence than former kings. The place for the circus, which is now called Maximus, was then first marked out, and spaces were parted off for the senators and knights, where they might each erect seats for themselves. They were called fori, benches. They viewed the games from scaffolding which supported seats 12 feet high from the ground. The show took place. Horses and boxers were sent for, chiefly from Etruria. These solemn games afterwards continued annual, being variously called the Roman and Great Games. By the same king also spaces round the forum were portioned off for private individuals to build on, porticos and shops were erected. 36. He was also preparing to surround the city with a stone wall, when a Sabine war obstructed his designs. The matter was so sudden that the enemy had passed the Anio before the Roman army could meet and stop them. Great alarm therefore was produced at Rome, and at first they fought with dubious success, but with great slaughter on both sides. After this, the enemy's forces being led back into their camp, and the Romans getting time to make new levies for the war, Tarquin, thinking that the weakness of his army lay in the want of horse, determined to add other centuries to the Ramnances, the Titiances, and loose res which Romulus had appointed, and to leave them distinguished by his own name. Because Romulus had done this by augury, Titus Livius, at that time a celebrated soothsayer, insisted that no alteration or new appointment of that kind could be made unless the birds approved of it. The king, enraged at this, and, as it is related, ridiculing the art, said, "Come, thou diviner, tell me whether what I am thinking on can be done or not." When he had tried the matter by divination, he affirmed it certainly could. "But I was thinking," says he, "whether you could cut asunder this whetstone with a razor. Take it, and perform what thy birds portend may be done." Upon this, as they say, he immediately cut the whetstone in two. A statue of Attis, with his head veiled, was erected in the Comitium, upon the very steps on the left of the Senate House, on the spot where the transaction occurred. They say that the whetstone also was deposited in the same place, that it might remain a monument of that miracle to posterity. There certainly accrued so much honour to augury and the College of Augurs, that nothing was undertaken either in peace or war without taking the auspices. Assemblies of the people, the summoning of armies, and affairs of the greatest importance were put off, when the birds would not allow of them. Nor did Tarquin then make any other alteration in the centuries of horse, except doubling the number of men in each of these corps, so that the 3 centuries consisted of 1,800 knights. Those that were added were called the younger, but by the same names with the former, which, now that they have been doubled, they call 6 centuries. 37. This part of his forces being augmented, a second battle is fought with the Sabines. But, besides that the Roman army was thus reinforced, a stratagem also is secretly resorted to, persons having been sent to throw into the river a great quantity of timber that lay on the banks of the Anio, it being first set on fire, and the wood being further kindled by favour of the wind, and the greater part of it, being placed on rafts, when it stuck firmly impacted against the piers, sets the bridge on fire. This accident struck terror into the Sabines during the battle, and, after they were routed, impeded their flight, so that many, who had escaped the enemy, perished in the river. Their arms floating down the Tiber, and being recognized at the city, made known the victory, almost before any account of it could be carried there. In that action the glory of the cavalry was prominent. They say that, being posted in the 2 wings, when the centre of their own infantry was being beaten, they charged so briskly in flank, that they not only checked the Sabine legions who pressed hard on those who retired, but quickly put them to flight. The Sabines made for the mountains with great precipitation, yet few reached them, for, as we said before, the greatest part were driven by the cavalry into the river. Tarquin, thinking it advisable to pursue the enemy closely while in this consternation, after sending the booty and the prisoners to Rome, piling up and burning the spoils which he had vowed to Vulcan, proceeds to lead his army onward into the Sabine territory. And though matters had turned out adversely, nor could they hope for better success, yet, because the occasion did not allow time for deliberation, the Sabines came out to meet him with a hastily raised army, and being again defeated there, and matters having now become desperate, they sued for peace. 38. Calatia and all the land about it was taken from the Sabines, and Egerius, son to the king's brother, was left there with a garrison. I understand that the people of Calatia were thus surrendered, and that the form of the surrender was as follows. The king asked them, "Are ye ambassadors and deputies sent by the people of Calatia to surrender yourselves and the people of Calatia?" "We are." "Are the people of Calatia their own masters?" "They are." "Do ye surrender yourselves and the people of Calatia, their city, lands, water, boundaries, temples, utensils, and everything sacred or profane belonging to them, into my power and that of the Roman people?" "We do." "Then I receive them." The Sabine war being ended, Tarquin returned in triumph to Rome. After that he made war upon the ancient Latins, where they came on no occasion to a general engagement, yet by carrying about his arms to the several towns, he subdued the whole Latin nation. Corniculum, Old Ficulia, Cameria, Crustumerium, Amiriola, Medullia, and Nomentum, towns which either belonged to the ancient Latins, or which had revolted to them, were taken. Upon this a peace was concluded. The works of peace were then set about with greater spirit, even than the efforts with which he had conducted his wars, so that the people enjoyed no more ease and quiet at home than they had done abroad, for he both set about surrounding the city with a stone wall on the side where he had not fortified it, the beginning of which work had been interrupted by the Sabine War, and the lower parts of the city round the Forum and the other valleys lying between the hills, because they did not easily carry off the water from the flat grounds, he drains by means of saws drawn sloping downward into the Tiber. Moreover, he levels an area for founding a temple to Jupiter in the capital, which he had vowed to him in the Sabine War, his mind even then presaging the future grandeur of the place. 39. At that time, a prodigy occurred in the palace, wonderful both in its appearance and in its result. They relate that the head of a boy, called Servius Tullius, as he lay fast asleep, blazed with fire in the sight of many persons. That by the very great noise made at so miraculous a phenomenon, the royal family were awakened, and when one of the servants was bringing water to extinguish the flame, that he was kept back by the queen, and after the confusion was over, that she forbade the boy to be disturbed till he should awake of his own accord. As soon as he awoke, the flame disappeared. Then Tanaquil, taking her husband into a private place, said, "Do you observe this boy whom we bring up in so mean a style? Be assured that hereafter he will be a light to us in our adversity, and a protector to our palace in distress. From henceforth let us, with all our care, train up this youth, who is capable of becoming a great ornament publicly and privately." From this time the boy began to be treated as their own son, and instructed in those arts by which men's minds are qualified to maintain high rank. The matter was easily accomplished, because it was agreeable to the gods. The young man turned out to be of a disposition truly royal. Nor, when they looked out for a son-in-law for Tarquin, could any of the Roman youth be compared to him in any accomplishment. Therefore the king betrothed his own daughter to him. This high honor conferred upon him, from whatever cause, prevents us from believing that he was the son of a slave, and that he had himself been a slave when young. I am rather of the opinion of those who say that, on the taking of Corniculum, the wife of Servius Tullius, who had been the leading man in that city, being pregnant when her husband was slain, being known among the other female prisoners, and, in consequence of her high rank, exempted from servitude by the Roman queen, was delivered of a child at Rome, in the house of Tarquinius Priscus. Upon this, that both the intimacy between the ladies was improved by so great a kindness, and that the boy, having been brought up in the house from his infancy, was beloved and respected, that his mother's lot, in having fallen into the hands of the enemy, caused him to be considered the son of a slave. 40. About the 38th year of Tarquin's reign, Servius Tullius was in the highest esteem, not only with the king, but also with the senate and people. At this time the two sons of Ancus, though they had before that always considered it the highest indignity that they had been deprived of their father's crown by the treachery of their guardian, that a stranger should be king of Rome, who was not only not of a civic, but not even of an Italian family, yet now felt their indignation rise to a still higher pitch at the notion that the crown would not only not revert to them after Tarquin, but would descend even lower to a slave, so that in the same state about the 100th year after Romulus, descended from a deity, and a deity himself, occupied the throne as long as he lived, a slave, and one born of a slave, should now possess it. That it would be a disgrace both common to the Roman name, and more especially to their family, if, whilst there was male issue of King Ancus still living, the sovereignty of Rome should be accessible not only to strangers, but even to slaves. They determined therefore to prevent that disgrace by the sword. But both resentment for the injury done to them incensed them more against Tarquin himself than against Servius, and the consideration that a king was likely to prove a more severe avenger of the murder, if he should survive, than a private person, and moreover, in case of Servius being put to death, whatever other person he might select as his son-in-law, it seemed likely that he would adopt as his successor on the throne. For these reasons the plot is laid against the king himself. Two of the most ferocious of the shepherds being selected for the daring deed, with the rustic implements to which each had been accustomed, by conducting themselves in as violent a manner as possible in the porch of the palace, under pretence of a quarrel, draw the attention of all the king's attendants to themselves. Then, when both appealed to the king, and their clamour reached even the interior of the palace, they are called in and proceed before the king. At first both bawled aloud, and vied in interrupting each other by their clamour, until being restrained by the lictor, and commanded to speak in turns, they at length cease railing. According to concert, one begins to state the matter. When the king, attentive to him, had turned himself quite that way, the other, raising up his axe, struck it into his head, and leaving the weapon in the wound, they both rush out of the house. 41. When those who were around had raised up the king in a dying state, the lictors seize on the men who were endeavouring to escape. Upon this followed an uproar and concourse of people, wondering what the matter was. Tarquinius, during the tumult, orders the palace to be shut, thrusts out all who were present. At the same time she sedulously prepares everything necessary for dressing the wound, as if a hope still remained. At the same time, in case her hopes should disappoint her, she projects other means of safety. Sending immediately for Servius, after she had showed to him her husband almost expiring, holding his right hand, she entreats him not to suffer the death of his father-in-law to pass unavenged, nor his mother-in-law to be an object of insult to their enemies. Servius, she said, if you are a man, the kingdom is yours, not theirs, who, by the hands of others, have perpetrated the worst of crimes. Exert yourself, and follow the guidance of the gods, who portended that this head would be illustrious by having formerly shed a blaze around it. Now let that celestial flame arouse you. Now awake in earnest. We, too, though foreigners, have reigned. Consider who you are, not whence you are sprung. If your own plans are not matured by reason of the suddenness of this event, then follow mine. When the uproar and violence of the multitude could scarcely be withstood, Tarquinius addresses the populace from the upper part of the palace through the windows facing the new street, for the royal family resided near the temple of Jupiter Stator. She bids them be of good courage, that the king was stunned by the suddenness of the blow, that the weapon had not sunk deep into his body, that he was already come to himself again, that the wound had been examined, the blood having been wiped off, that all the symptoms were favourable, that she hoped they would see him very soon, and that, in the meantime, he commanded the people to obey the orders of Servius Tullius, that he would administer justice, and would perform all the functions of the king. Servius comes forth with the trabea and lictors, and seating himself on the king's throne, decides some cases, with respect to others pretends that he will consult the king. Therefore, the death being concealed for several days, though Tarquin had already expired, he, under pretence of discharging the duty of another, strengthened his own interest. Then at length the matter being made public, and lamentations being raised in the palace, Servius, supported by a strong guard, took possession of the kingdom by the consent of the Senate, being the first who did so without the orders of the people. The children of Ancus, the instruments of their villainy having been already seized, as soon as it was announced that the king still lived, and that the power of Servius was so great, had already gone into exile to Suessa Pometia. 42. And now Servius began to strengthen his power, not more by public than by private measures, and lest the feelings of the children of Tarquin might be the same toward himself as those of the children of Ancus had been towards Tarquin, he unites his two daughters in marriage to the young princes, the Tarquinii, Lucius, and Aruns. Nor yet did he break through the inevitable decrees of fate by human measures, so that envy of the sovereign power should not produce general treachery and animosity even among the members of his own family. Very opportunely for maintaining the tranquillity of the present state, a war was commenced with the Veientes, for the truce had now expired, and with the other Etrurians. In that war, both the valour and good fortune of Tullius were conspicuous, and he returned to Rome, after routing a great army of the enemy, now unquestionably king, whether he tried the dispositions of the fathers or the people. He then sets about a work of peace of the utmost importance, that, as Numa had been the author of religious institutions, so posterity might celebrate Servius as the founder of all distinction among the members of the state, and of those orders by which a limitation is established between the degrees of rank and fortune. For he instituted the census, a most salutary measure for an empire destined to become so great, according to which the services of war and peace were to be performed, not by every person, indiscriminately, as formerly, but in proportion to the amount of property. Then he formed, according to the census, the classes and centuries, and the arrangement as it now exists, eminently suited either to peace or war. 43. Of those who had an estate of 100,000 asses or more, he made 80 centuries, 40 of seniors and 40 of juniors. All these were called the first class. The seniors were to be in readiness to guard the city, the juniors to carry on war abroad. The arms enjoined them were a helmet, a round shield, greaves, and a coat of mail, all of brass. These were for the defence of their body. Their weapons of offence were a spear and a sword. To this class were added 2 centuries of mechanics, who were to serve without arms. The duty imposed upon them was to carry the military engines. The second class comprehended all whose estate was from 75 to 100,000 asses, and of these, seniors and juniors, 20 centuries were enrolled. The arms enjoined them were a buckler instead of a shield, and except a coat of mail, all the rest were the same. He appointed the property of the third class to amount to 50,000 asses. The number of centuries was the same, and formed with the same distinction of age, nor was there any change in their arms, only greaves were taken from them. In the fourth class, the property was 25,000 asses, the same number of centuries was formed, the arms were changed, nothing was given them but a spear and a long javelin. The fifth class was increased, 30 centuries were formed, these carried slings and stones for throwing. Among them were reckoned the horn-blowers and the trumpeters, distributed into 3 centuries. This whole class was rated at 11,000 asses. Property lower than this comprehended all the rest of the citizens, and of them 1 century was made up which was exempted from serving in war. Having thus divided and armed the infantry, he levied 12 centuries of knights from among the chief men of the state. Likewise out of the 3 centuries, appointed by Romulus, he formed other 6 under the same names which they had received at their first institution. 10,000 asses were given them out of the public revenue, for the buying of horses, and widows were assigned them, who were to pay 2,000 asses yearly for the support of the horses. All these burdens were taken off the poor and laid on the rich. Then an additional honour was conferred upon them, for the suffrage was not now granted promiscuously to all, as it had been established by Romulus and observed by his successors, to every man with the same privilege and the same right, but gradations were established, so that no one might seem excluded from the right of voting, and yet the whole power might reside in the chief men of the state. For the knights were first called, and then the 80 centuries of the first class, and if they happened to differ, which was seldom the case, those of the second were called, and they seldom ever descended so low as to come to the lowest class. Nor need we be surprised that the present regulation, which now exists, since the tribes were increased to 35, should not agree in the number of centuries of juniors and seniors with the amount instituted by Servius Tullius, they being now double of what they were at that time. For the city being divided into 4 parts, according to the regions and hills which were then inhabited, he called these divisions tribes, as I think, from the tribute. For the method of levying taxes ratably according to the value of estates was also introduced by him, nor had these tribes any relation to the number and distribution of the centuries. 44. The census being now completed, which he had expedited by the terror of a law passed on those not rated, with threats of imprisonment and death, he issued a proclamation that all the Roman citizens, horse and foot, should attend at the dawn of day in the Ancus Marcius, each in his century. There he drew up his army and performed a lustration of it by the sacrifices called Suoveterilia, and that was called the closing of the lustrum, because that was the conclusion of the census. 80,000 citizens are said to have been rated in that survey. Fabius Pictor, the oldest of our historians, adds that such was the number of those who were able to bear arms. To accommodate that number the city seemed to require enlargement. He adds 2 hills, the Quirinal and Viminal. Then in continuation he enlarges the Esquilii, and takes up his own residence there, in order that respectability might attach to the place. He surrounds the city with a rampart, a moat, and a wall. Thus he enlarges the Pomoerium. They who regard only the etymology of the word will have the Pomoerium to be a space of ground without the walls, but it is rather a space on each side the wall, which the Etrurians in building cities consecrated by augury, reaching to a certain extent both within and without in the direction they intended to raise the wall, so that the houses might not be joined to it on the inside, as they commonly are now, and also that there might be some space without left free from human occupation. This space, which it was not lawful to till or inhabit, the Romans called the pomoerium, not for its being without the wall, more than for the walls being without it, and in enlarging the city, as far as the walls were intended to proceed outwards, so far these consecrated limits were likewise extended. 45. The state being increased by the enlargement of the city, and everything modelled at home and abroad for the exigencies both of peace and war, that the acquisition of power might not always depend on mere force of arms, he endeavoured to extend his empire by policy, and at the same time to add some ornament to the city. The temple of Diana at Ephesus was at that time in high renown. Fame represented it to have been built by all the states of Asia in common. When Servius, amid some grandees of the Latins with whom he had taken pains to form connections of hospitality and friendship, extolled in high terms such concord and association of their gods, by frequently insisting on the same subject, he at length prevailed so far as that the Latin states agreed to build a temple to Diana at Rome in conjunction with the Roman people. This was an acknowledgment that Rome was the head of both nations, concerning which they had so often disputed in arms. Though that object seemed to have been left out of consideration by all the Latins, in consequence of the matter having been so often attempted unsuccessfully by arms, fortune seemed to present one of the Sabines with an opportunity of recovering the superiority to his country by his own address. A cow is said to have been carved to a certain person, the head of a family among the Sabines, of surprising size and beauty. Her horns, which were hung up in the porch of the temple of Diana, remained, for many ages, a monument of this wonder. The thing was looked upon as a prodigy, as it was, and the soothsayers declared that sovereignty would reside in that state of which a citizen should immolate this heifer to Diana. This prediction had also reached the ears of the high priest of Diana. The Sabine, when he thought the proper time for offering the sacrifice was come, drove the cow to Rome, led her to the temple of that goddess, and set her before the altar. The Roman priest, struck with the uncommon size of the victim, so much celebrated by fame, thus accosted the Sabine. "What intendest thou to do, stranger?" says he. "Is it with impure hands to offer a sacrifice to Diana? Why dost not thou first wash thyself in running water? The Tiber runs along in the bottom of that valley." The stranger, being seized with a scruple of conscience, and desirous of having everything done in due form, that the event might answer the prediction, from the temple went down to the Tiber. In the meantime the priest sacrificed the cow to Diana, which gave great satisfaction to the king and to the whole state. 46. Servius, though he had now acquired an indisputable right to the kingdom by long possession, yet as he heard that expressions were sometimes thrown out by young Tarquin, importing that he held the crown without the consent of the people, having first secured their good will by dividing among them, man by man, the lands taken from their enemies, he ventured to propose the question to the people, whether they chose and ordered that he should be king, and was declared king with such unanimity as had not been observed in the election of any of his predecessors. But this circumstance diminished not Tarquin's hope of obtaining the throne. Nay, because he had observed that the question of the distribution of land to the people was carried against the will of the fathers, he felt so much the more satisfied that an opportunity was now presented to him of arraigning Servius before the fathers, and of increasing his own influence in the Senate, he being himself naturally of a fiery temper, and his wife, Tullia, at home stimulating his restless temper. For the Roman palace also afforded an instance of tragic guilt, so that through their disgust of kings, liberty might come more matured, and the throne, which should be attained through crime, might be the last. This L. Tarquinius, whether he was the son or grandson of Tarquinius Priscus, is not clear. With the greater number of authorities, however, I would say, his son had a brother, Aruns Tarquinius, a youth of a mild disposition. To these two, as has been already stated, the two Tullii, daughters of the king, had been married, they also being of widely different tempers. It had so happened that the two violent dispositions were not united in marriage, through the good fortune, I suspect, of the Roman people, in order that the reign of Servius might be more protracted, and the morals of the state be firmly established. The haughty Tullia was chagrined that there was no material in her husband, either for ambition or bold daring. Directing all her regard to the other Tarquinius, him she admired, him she called a man, and one truly descended of royal blood, she expressed her contempt of her sister, because, having got a man, she was deficient in the spirit becoming a woman. Similarity of mind soon draws them together, as wickedness is in general most congenial to wickedness. But the commencement of producing general confusion originated with the woman. She, accustomed to the secret conversations of the other's husband, refrained not from using the most contumelious language of her husband to his brother, of her sister to her sister's husband, and contended that it were better that she herself were unmarried and he single, than that they should be matched unsuitably, so that they must languish away through life by reason of the dastardly conduct of others. If the gods had granted her the husband of whom she was worthy, that she should soon see the crown in her own house, which she now saw at her father's. She soon inspires the young man with her own daring notions. Aruns Tarquinius and the younger Tullia, when they had, by immediate successive deaths, made their houses vacant for new nuptials, are united in marriage, Servius rather not prohibiting than approving the measure. 47. Then indeed the old age of Servius began to be every day more disquieted, his reign to be more unhappy. For now the woman looked from one crime to another, and suffered not her husband to rest by night or by day, lest their past murders might go for nothing. That what she had wanted was not a person whose wife she might be called, or one with whom she might in silence live a slave. What she had wanted was one who would consider himself worthy of the throne, who would remember that he was the son of Tarquinius Priscus, who would rather possess a kingdom than hope for it. If you, to whom I consider myself married, are such a one, I address you both as husband and king. But if not, our condition has been changed so far for the worse, as in that person crime is associated with meanness. Why not prepare yourself? It is not necessary for you, as for your father, coming here, from Corinth or Tarquinii, to strive for foreign thrones. Your household and country's gods, the image of your father, and the royal palace, and the royal throne in that palace, constitute and call you king. Or if you have too little spirit for this, why do you disappoint the nation? Why do you suffer yourself to be looked up to as a prince? Get hence to Tarquinii or Corinth. Sink back again to your original race, more like your brother than your father. By chiding him in these and other terms, she spurs on the young man, nor can she herself rest, indignant, that when Tanaquil, a foreign woman, could achieve so great a project as to bestow 2 successive thrones on her husband, and then on her son-in-law, she, sprung from royal blood, should have no weight in bestowing and taking away a kingdom. Tarquinius, driven on by these frenzied instigations of the woman, began to go round and solicit the patricians, especially those of the younger families, reminded them of his father's kindness, and claimed a return for it, enticed the young men by presents, increased his interest, as well by making magnificent promises on his own part, as by inveighing against the king at every opportunity. At length, as soon as the time seemed convenient for accomplishing his object, he rushed into the forum, accompanied by a party of armed men. Then, whilst all were struck with dismay, seating himself on the throne before the Senate House, he ordered the fathers to be summoned to the Senate House by the crier to attend King Tarquinius. They assembled immediately, some being already prepared for the occasion, some through fear, lest their not having come might prove detrimental to them, astounded at the novelty and strangeness of the matter, and considering that it was now all over with Servius. Then Tarquinius, commencing his invectives against his immediate ancestors, that a slave, and born of a slave, after the untimely death of his parent, without an interregnum being adopted, as on former occasions, without any comitia being held, without the suffrages of the people or the sanction of the fathers, he had taken possession of the kingdom as the gift of a woman. That so born, so created king, ever a favourer of the most degraded class, to which he himself belongs, through a hatred of the high station of others, he had taken their land from the leading men of the state and divided it among the very meanest, that he had laid all the burdens, which were formerly common, on the chief members of the community, that he had instituted the census, in order that the fortune of the wealthier citizens might be conspicuous to excite public envy, and that all was prepared whence he might bestow largesses on the most needy, whenever he might please. 48. When Servius, aroused by the alarming announcement, came in during this harangue, immediately from the porch of the Senate house, he says with a loud voice, "What means this, Tarquin? By what audacity hast thou dared to summon the fathers, while I am still alive, or to sit on my throne?" To this, when he fiercely replied that he, the son of a king, occupied the throne of his father, a much fitter successor to the throne than a slave, that he, Servius, had insulted his masters full long enough by his arbitrary shuffling, a shout arises from the partisans of both, and a rush of the people into the Senate house took place, and it became evident that whoever came off victor would have the throne. Then Tarquin, necessity itself now obliging him to have recourse to the last extremity, having much the advantage both in years and strength, seizes Servius by the middle, and having taken him out of the Senate house, throws him down the steps to the bottom. He then returns to the Senate house to assemble the Senate. The king's officers and attendants fly. He himself, almost lifeless, when he was returning home with his royal retinue frightened to death, and had arrived at the top of the Cyprian Street, is slain by those who had been sent by Tarquin, and had overtaken him in his flight. As the act is not inconsistent with her other marked conduct, it is believed to have been done by Tullia's advice. Certain it is, for it is readily admitted, that driving into the Forum in her chariot, and not abashed by the crowd of persons there, she called her husband out of the Senate house, and was the first to style him king, and when, on being commanded by him to withdraw from such a tumult, she was returning home, and had arrived at the top of the Cyprian Street, where Diana's temple lately was, as she was turning to the right to the Orbean hill, in order to arrive at the Esquiline, the person who was driving, being terrified, stopped and drew in the reins, and pointed out to his mistress the murdered Servius as he lay. On this occasion a revolting and inhuman crime is stated to have been committed, and the place is a monument of it. They call it the Wicked Street, where Tullia, frantic and urged on by the furies of her sister and husband, is reported to have driven her chariot over her father's body, and to have carried a portion of her father's body and blood to her own and her husband's household gods, herself also being stained and sprinkled with it, through whose vengeance results corresponding to the wicked commencement of the reign was soon to follow. Tullius reigned 44 years in such a manner that a competition with him would prove difficult even for a good and moderate successor. But this also has been an accession to his glory, that with him perished all just and legitimate reigns. This authority, so mild and so moderate, yet, because it was vested in one, some say that he had it in contemplation to resign, had not the wickedness of his family interfered with him whilst meditating the liberation of his country.